Now, up to a few days ago, what was available was the raid testing in the PTR for Season 3, which we went through. We looked at the results in the raid from both the healer and the DPS perspective, just to have an idea, for example, of the power of the tier sets in the PTR. However, what was also going on while the raid testing was available, and what is still available right now in the PTR, was the testing for Mythic Plus. Being able to get into Mythic Plus keys, especially last week, where you could go into the new added Mythic Plus dungeon of Season 3, Echo Dome Aldani, which was testable. Now this week we have gotten the Season 1 dungeon being testable in Mythic Plus. There was way more interest in testing the new dungeon last week, so now we have also time to check the results of what has gone down in Mythic Plus. It is not nearly as much to check who is OP in Mythic Plus in the PTR, but more so to get an idea of the interest of the players in the PTR, right? Because, you know, if, for example, right now in live a certain spec, like, say, Devastation Evoker is the most played and the one that performs the best, and then you go in the PTR and now suddenly everyone is playing Augmentation, you're wondering, hold on, what's going down in Season 3 for everyone to move from Devastation to Augmentation, for example? So you can get some ideas of what players, top level players, try hard players who decide to spend time testing things in the PTR are thinking in this for this new season. So we can start by the results happening when it comes to tanks. So when it comes to tanks, we do have the confirmation, as you can see here, that the most played tank overall has been Vengeance, even in the PTR. However, the very close second in terms of play rate in the PTR was Brewmaster Monk. As we said, there was some, you know, there were some positive changes going the way of Master Monk in the PTR, going from the live version to 11.2 and getting this entire center line around your Invoke Newsau changed and much more empowered, as well as, of course, the now much more powerful Celestial Infusion has gotten a bunch of tanks interested in playing Brewmaster. So the result is that now roughly 40% of the tanks in the high keys in Mythic Plus that were being tested. So you start out checking out keys in the 18 plus 18 level in the PTR, which is of course very few, and then you go down to 17, which is a bit more. You go down to 16, which is slightly more, and then 15s being the barrier of entry for the high keys tested in Mythic Plus. About 40% of tanks were Vengeance, 41%, and then 37% were Brewmaster. It is of course a much closer divide than what we have right now in live, of course, with the popularity of Vengeance. After those two, there was of course a bigger drop of the other tanks. The second most played tank overall after Brewmaster was Protection Warrior. That was the other one at about 12% play rate. And then the much more underplayed one being Protection Paladin, Guardian Druid, and the absolute lowest down being Blood DK. Blood DK had like only a handful of tests in high level keys being tested in Mythic Plus compared to Vengeance, Brewmaster, and even Protection Warrior. So that's what you might get as a hint of what players are thinking to play in the next season when it comes to tanks. You do have actually something somewhat similar when it comes to healers, because healers is a similar situation to tanks, just like you have Vengeance here. Discipline is also similarly popular. So in the PTR, actually, the number one healer wasn't Discipline. The number one healer was Resto Druid. Overall, Resto Druid was close between Resto Druid and Discipline Priest, but overall 40% of the healers in Mythic Plus tested right now were Resto Druids in the high level keys, and 35% of them were Discipline. So you did have slightly more Resto Druids than you had Discipline Priest. Now, to be fair, in the PTR right now, Discipline Priest plays exactly the same as you are playing it in live. Nothing is changing. You're still playing Oracle. Your tier set isn't really doing anything extra other than giving you Well, in Mythic Plus, it wouldn't be a machine gun of Penance. In Mythic Plus, it would be good because now you can use Penance into Pyro Shield, into Penance, into Pyro Shield with no cooldowns because of how powerful Pyro Shield is in Mythic Plus for Discipline. Whereas, you know, Resto Druid does have more changes in the PTR. You do have the tier sets. Both of them actually were being played in the PTR, but the one that was the overwhelmingly powerful one was, of course, Wild Stalker, which was also nerfed. As we have checked the balance tuning of a few days ago, Wild Stalker was the target of the nerfs we mentioned. It was likely due to their power in Mythic Plus, which is what we have seen Resto Druids being the most popular of the healers in Mythic Plus, playing with this build, most of them. So those two make up the majority of the healers in the higher, 15 plus level keys being tested in the PTR. After them, you had 13% or so of Resto Shamans and 8% Mistweaver Monks. Those were still, healthily played across the board. It's not that for Mistweaver especially much of anything is changing. Actually, they play just about exactly the same as they do now. Their tier set in Mythic Plus is very passive. They don't really change much of anything. And then at the bottom you do have the forgotten, destitute specs like Holy Paladin, Holy Priest, and Preservation Evoker. Nothing positive is happening for them in the PTR right now. They would require some significant spec changes, especially for Holy Priest and for Preservation Evoker, to make it to become very popular in Mythic Plus. For Holy Paladin, they have different problems than that, but either way, all three of them have been overall very underplayed in the PTR. You have to actually struggle to find at least one of them playing or trying out the specs in high enough level keys than when they were being tested in the PTR. So we do have some reasonably interesting head-to-head going down right now in the PTR when it comes to popularity. For tanks, it's Vengeance and Brewmaster, and for healers, it's Resto Druid and Discipline Priest. Now, obviously, as we often mention, much of the composition in Mythic Plus often ends up being about specs of a certain class. For example, we're talking about Discipline being head-to-head with Resto Druid. However, at the moment, one of the most meta specs is Balance. So what would happen if you ended up in a situation where Discipline is just as popular as Resto Druid, but Balanced Druid is also a very popular DPS spec? Well, what would happen historically is that Resto Druid would die to let Balanced Druid live. You can find multiple practical examples. We even don't have to leave this expansion because Resto Shaman was, as you remember, the mega meta healer in the first month and a half of the expansion, and then enhancement became meta and Restoration Shaman disappeared. You can check even backwards in Dragonflight. You can have examples like, for example, Havoc starts out Season 3 very strong, and then people decide that the head-to-head between Prot and Vengeance is won by Vengeance, and Havoc disappears. That is what often happens. So yes, Discipline and the Restoration Druid are being played quite a lot, both of them in the PTR. However, we do also have, when it comes to DPS, an interesting head-to-head, because amongst the more popular of the DPS specs being played in the PTR, we do have some confirmations based on their power that we already looked at in the raid, like Marksmanship Hunter. So, Marksmanship Hunter, as we also checked out already, has been nerfed upwards of 10 to 15% in AoE damage when it comes to Black Arrow, Dark Ranger, Marksmanship, which is what was nerfed, so they are getting hit, but they were one of the more popular DPS specs in Mythic Plus when it came to testing. All of the hunters, practically all of them playing with Dark Ranger, with the damage, very high damage of Black Arrow. It was nerfed, but it was still a very popular spec. After them, the other confirmation is Arcane Mage, and this is not really changing from live. Arcane is still the de facto very popular spec in Mythic Plus. They still do their niche, their ability to funnel the highest HP mob to prio damage the highest HP mob with their Arcane Barrage damage, and it's remained the same in the PTR even with their tier sets, so it's not much is changing for them. the current situation of both Frost and Fire is not nearly as good as Arcane when it comes to Mythic Plus, so nothing is changing for them in the interest players have in playing the spec for the next season. What is changing more though is that now you don't just have Balanced Druid. Balanced Druid has remained as one of the more played specs in the PTR. However, you now also have Shadow Priest. Shadow Priest, after the changes, has been played quite a bit. Yes, Shadow Priest was also nerfed in the last set of tuning. These are not nearly as important in Mythic Plus. In terms of popularity, Shadow Priest has grown quite a bit. Balanced Druid is still there. You know, overall, perhaps they're still in the top 3, top 4 of the popular specs. However, they are splitting time with Shadow Priest, especially because now you have to work around the comps, because now you can see the Shadow Priest with the Resto Druid, right? There's a Shadow Priest, there's the Resto Druid. Shadow Priest, Resto Druid. Then you move to Disc, and here's the Balanced Druid. Talking about the composition, mixing together all of your classes and buffs for your composition. We are now in an interesting situation where 2 healers are Priest Druid, doing very well, and 2 DPS, doing very well, are also Priest Druid. But we know this can't last. We know the final winners of this fight cannot be both Priests, or cannot be both Druids. It will have to be 1 Druid and 1 Priest, or 1 Priest and 1 Druid. So that's an interesting situation right now going down in the PTR with the changes given to Shadow Priest recently. The other one of the changes is at least for now, Death Knights are in a bit of a depressing situation right now, but what resulted from this depression is the fact that, first of all, the popularity of Death Knight has dropped off a cliff. In terms of, compared to this, in the PTR, there is very much fewer Death Knights found playing DPS. You can even scroll here at max speed and you don't find that many Death Knights. And this is in basically the top highest keys in the PTR, and basically you can find barely any. If you do find any though, they are Frost. They are not Unholy. It seems like after the several changes, like losing A-Bomb Limb, like also losing your AoE uncappedness of your bursting swords as well, not many players are that excited in playing Unholy next season. And there is a very clear result, very clear end product right now in the PTR, where this number has gone down to basically this number pretty much. There's been an exodus of Unholy Death Knights when it comes to Mythic Plus. Now, who is taking their place? Well, Marksmanship has taken their place pretty much in the PTR. This has been replaced by Marksmanship. This is still here. This is now split, basically 24 is now 12-12 between Balance and Shadow Priest, and then the last spot is still Arcane in terms of popularity. The other ones that are still present quite a bit in the testing in the PTR, as you see here, you have Havoc Demon Hunter and both Elemental and Enhancement Shaman, as well as Devastation Evoker and Ret Paladin. Overall, these have been the specs that you will find the most outside of the more popular ones we mentioned, being Arcane, Balance, Marksmanship, and Shadow Priest. Those are the other ones that you find more often in the keys in Mythic Plus. If the ones have not been mentioned, it's because they were quite underplayed overall. So if you were curious about, specs like what about Assassination Rogue, what about Feral Druid, or what about Destrolock, Arms Warrior, Demolock, or Frost Mage, or Fury Warrior, that's because they were barely even visible in all of these keys overall in terms of popularity in Mythic Plus. So I thought it was cool to go and check right now, because this can be, as we mentioned, often be a hint, a trend, a canary in a coal mine that tells you what might happen very soon based on the interest of players in the PTR. As we mentioned, for example, if we went in the PTR and we saw the most played healer was, for example, Preservation, you'll be like, hold on a second, what happened first of all, what happened to Discipline to make them not as popular, and then what happened to Preservation to make them the most popular healer, right? So they might be a hint towards the trend of what players might be thinking of playing in the meta, basically, of next season. So some can be confirmations, like the confirmation of Arcane still doing well, of Balance still doing well, of Vengeance and of Discipline still doing well. Even Red Paladin actually has continued to be very solid in terms of play rate, even in the PTR. And then you have some new entries. The new entry of Shadow Priest, which is basically not even existing right now because of the oppressiveness of Discipline. You have also the growth of Restoration Druid, which is also oppressed by Discipline, and also by the fact that Balanced Druid is meta right now, as well as Marksmanship after the changes to Dark Ranger, how much damage they have been doing. Of course, many of these, all of the ones happening to the testing of Echo de Maldari, were right before the testing, the most recent testing in the PTR. So we will have to see when we get more PTR testing of higher level keys. Right now, as mentioned, what is available in this weekend basically is the currently Season 1, basically the Season 1 dungeons, or the currently existing Floodgate and Priory that are being tested. So once we have even more data on these newer dungeon post changes, so post nerfs and post buffs of the specs that were changed, we can go deeper down on them as well. But for today, on this Sunday, this is what we have been seeing in terms of trends of what has gone down in terms of play rate in Mythic Plus as well. After checking what has gone down in the raid, the other very important, activity, PvE activity in the end game was Mythic Plus, and this is what has been happening so far in testing of Mythic Plus keys for Season 3. So with this, we can now leave each other on this Sunday. We are starting the goodbyes as usual by thanking everyone for having watched the video, together with, of course, everyone else who's been supporting completely for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, I'm still not too sure about the color palette of this light in front of me. I think it needs to be slightly less bright and more opaque.